Listen closely, because this may be the moment that changes how you see your pain. There is a kind of silence that only arrives after someone leaves, and it is in that silence that truth begins to speak. Not loudly, not urgently, but clearly. If you've ever walked away wondering why your love wasn't enough, why your patience felt invisible, why your heart carried the weight alone, this message is for you. Because sometimes the lesson isn't learned when you stay, it's learned when you leave. Here is the first thing avoidants only understand after you're gone. Emotional safety is not suffocation. While you were there, offering consistency, reassurance, and warmth, they mistook peace for pressure. They didn't know how to rest in love because chaos felt familiar. But once you left, they felt the cold difference between control and care. They realized that your steady presence wasn't trapping them, it was protecting them. And for the first time, they understood that love doesn't demand, it shelters. The second realization comes quietly but cuts deeply. Avoidance does not erase emotion, it delays it. While you were trying to talk, to connect, to heal together, they were running from discomfort. But distance has a way of unlocking everything that was buried. After you leave, the feelings arrive without permission. Regret, longing, confusion. They finally feel what you were carrying alone. This is not punishment, it is consequence. And it is often the beginning of awareness. Third, they come to understand that silence has a cost. Avoidants believe that by saying less, they avoid damage. But after you're gone, they see that unspoken truths don't disappear. They accumulate. They remember the conversations they avoided, the moments they shut down, the times you reached out and met a wall. And in your absence, that wall becomes a prison. They learn that intimacy is not built by perfection, but by courage. The courage to speak even when your voice shakes. The fourth truth is this: love cannot survive without vulnerability. While you were there, willing to be seen, they stayed guarded. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to let care in. After you leave, they realize that emotional distance doesn't make you strong, it makes you lonely. They understand, too late, that vulnerability was not your weakness, it was your gift. And now that gift is gone. Fifth, they begin to see your worth clearly, because it is no longer accessible. When you stopped explaining, stopped chasing, stopped proving, something shifted. Your absence became the boundary they never respected while you stayed. And this is where wisdom lives. Value is often recognized in reflection, not possession. You leaving was not abandonment, it was self-respect. And finally, the deepest understanding of all. You leaving was not meant to teach them, it was meant to free you. Growth may or may not happen on their side. Healing may or may not follow. But your soul was never meant to beg for emotional availability. Divine order does not require you to shrink, wait, or suffer to be loved. Sometimes, the lesson is not in staying faithful to the relationship, but in staying faithful to yourself. So if you're walking away, walk with peace, not bitterness, not revenge, just truth. Because when you chose yourself, you aligned with purpose. And whether they understand it now or later, your leaving was the message they could finally hear. When you were present, consistent, and emotionally available, what you offered was not intensity, drama, or control, it was safety. But to an avoidant heart, safety can feel unfamiliar, even threatening. Emotional safety asks nothing loud, yet it requires something deep: presence. And presence exposes what avoidance tries to hide. While you were there, your calm felt confusing. Your steadiness felt intrusive. Your willingness to stay felt like pressure, not because you demanded too much, but because it gently invited them to be seen. And that invitation unsettled parts of them that had learned survival through distance. Avoidants are often shaped in environments where closeness came with conditions, unpredictability, or emotional overwhelm. So when they encounter someone who loves without manipulation, who communicates without control, who remains without disappearing, their nervous system doesn't interpret it as peace. It interprets it as risk. They don't consciously think, this is unsafe, but something inside them tightens. They begin to associate your consistency with loss of autonomy, not realizing that true emotional safety never removes freedom. It enhances it. While you were there, they may have felt restless, irritated, or numb, not because you were doing something wrong, but because your presence highlighted what they had been avoiding in themselves. Emotional safety slows things down. It removes the distraction of chaos, and in that stillness, unresolved wounds begin to surface. Old fears, unmet needs, buried grief. Instead of turning inward to heal, they turn outward to escape. They convince themselves that something is missing, that the connection feels dull, that they need space, when in reality, what they need is regulation, not distance. Only after you leave does the truth begin to form. The absence creates contrast. Suddenly, the emotional quiet they once resisted turns into emotional emptiness. They realize that what they called space now feels hollow. The warmth they minimized is gone. The grounding energy you brought into their life is missing. And for the first time, they understand that emotional safety is not about excitement, it's about feeling held without being trapped. Your absence teaches what your presence could not. They begin to recognize that safety is rare, that being able to show up imperfectly and still be accepted is not common, that your patience wasn't weakness, it was emotional maturity. And the love you offered wasn't demanding, it was secure. The avoidant mind often only understands value through loss, because loss removes the option to keep running. There is no one left to project onto, no one left to blame for their discomfort, just silence and clarity. They start to replay moments differently. Conversations they once dismissed now feel significant. Your calm responses now feel like grace. The way you tried to understand instead of accuse now feels sacred. They realize too late that emotional safety is not something you stumble upon often in life. It is built, chosen, and protected. And when it's gone, replacing it is not easy. Because most connections don't offer peace. They offer distraction. This realization doesn't always lead to change, but it leads to awareness. They understand that safety is not boring. It's healing. And healing requires courage they didn't yet have. While you were there, they didn't know how to rest in love. After you leave, they finally understand that what felt like pressure was actually permission. To exhale, to be human, to stop performing. And whether they grow from that realization or not, one truth remains unshaken. You were not too much. You were simply offering something they didn't yet know how to receive. While you were trying to connect, they were trying not to feel. Avoidance is not the absence of emotion. It is the postponement of it. It is a strategy learned early, one that teaches the nervous system that emotional distance equals safety. So when moments of closeness appeared, when conversations leaned toward depth, when vulnerability knocked softly at the door, they didn't open it. They distracted themselves. They changed the subject. They withdrew. They told themselves they were fine. And in doing so, they believed they were keeping control. But emotions don't disappear just because they're ignored. They wait. During the relationship, you may have sensed this imbalance. You felt things deeply, processed them openly, and spoke them honestly. Meanwhile, they stayed composed, detached, or seemingly unaffected. This can make you question yourself. You wonder if you're too emotional, too intense, too invested. But what you were witnessing wasn't strength. It was emotional deferral. They were storing feelings for later, not eliminating them. And that later only arrives when you leave. Distance removes the buffer. When you are gone, there is no longer a relational shield to absorb their unprocessed emotions. No one is there to soften the impact, to bring warmth into moments of tension, to anchor the dynamic with consistency. And suddenly, the feelings they avoided begin to surface. Not in an organized way, but in waves. Longing shows up unexpectedly. Regret creeps in during quiet moments. Confusion arises when they realize they miss the very connection they resisted. This delayed emotional reckoning is often overwhelming. Avoidants are not practiced at sitting with feelings. They have spent years learning how to bypass them. So when emotion finally demands attention, it feels intrusive and destabilizing. They may feel sadness without knowing how to name it. They may feel anger without a clear target. They may feel loss without admitting what was lost. And in that internal chaos, a realization begins to form. Emotions require expression, not avoidance. Your absence becomes the catalyst. While you were present, your emotional availability unintentionally carried part of their load. You named things. You felt things. You tried to process together. That shared emotional labor kept them insulated from fully facing their inner world. But once you leave, there is no one left to translate their feelings for them. They must sit with their own inner experience, and that is something avoidance never prepared them for. They begin to understand that avoiding discomfort only multiplies it. What they postponed now arrives all at once. The conversations they didn't want to have replay in their mind. The moments they emotionally checked out now feel heavy with meaning. The connection they undervalued now feels irreplaceable. This is when they learn that emotional maturity isn't about staying unaffected. It's about staying present. There is also a spiritual dimension to this realization. Suppressed emotions don't just affect the heart, they affect the soul. Avoidance creates internal fragmentation, a separation between what is felt and what is acknowledged. When you leave, that separation becomes impossible to maintain. The soul seeks wholeness, and wholeness requires truth. The truth is that feelings demand to be honored, not escaped. Some avoidants try to numb this awakening by rushing into distractions, work, busyness, new connections. But even then, the awareness lingers. Because once the heart has been touched by genuine connection, it remembers. And once emotions are awakened, they cannot be put back to sleep permanently. What they finally understand is this: emotional pain is not the enemy. Avoidance is. Feeling does not weaken you, it integrates you. And while this realization often comes too late to save the relationship, it marks a turning point in self-awareness. You leaving didn't create their pain, it revealed it. While you were present, silence may have seemed harmless to them, an easy way to avoid conflict, discomfort, or emotional exposure. They believed that by not speaking, they were keeping the peace. But silence is never empty. It carries weight. It stores tension. It accumulates unspoken truths. And what avoidants fail to understand in the moment is that silence does not protect connection. It slowly erodes it. In the relationship, you may have noticed how conversations stayed surface level, how important topics were postponed, minimized, or brushed aside. When emotions arose, they retreated. When clarity was needed, they delayed. When repair was required, they went quiet. To them, this felt like self-preservation. To you, it felt like abandonment. But to the relationship itself, it was neglect. Because intimacy is not built by the absence of conflict, but by the willingness to move through it together. Silence allows unresolved emotions to linger beneath the surface. Each unspoken feeling becomes a layer of emotional residue. Over time, these layers create distance. Not dramatic distance, but subtle disconnection. Laughter still happens. Routines continue. But something vital begins to fade. The soul of the relationship grows quieter. And avoidants often don't notice this erosion while it's happening, because silence feels familiar. It feels controlled. It feels safe. Only after you leave does the cost of that silence become undeniable. In your absence, the quiet they once chose becomes unbearable. There is no one left to fill the space with warmth, reassurance, or presence. And the silence that once served as a shield now becomes a mirror. Every unspoken truth echoes louder. Every avoided conversation returns with urgency. The very words they withheld now demand to be heard, but there is no one left to receive them. This is when they begin to understand that silence doesn't prevent loss. It prepares it. By not expressing themselves, they didn't keep the relationship intact. They starved it of oxygen. Love requires voice. It requires risk. It requires the humility to say, "This is how I feel," even when the feeling is uncomfortable or inconvenient. Avoidants often confuse emotional restraint with emotional maturity. But restraint without honesty is not strength, it's fear in disguise. The regret that follows is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet awareness. I should have said more. They remember moments when you asked questions and received half answers. Times when you reached out emotionally and met distance instead of depth. They realize that your frustration wasn't about nagging or neediness. It was about longing for connection. And in that realization, they see that silence was not neutral. It was a choice. And every choice has consequences. Spiritually, silence can become a form of self-betrayal. When truth is not expressed, the inner self fractures. There is a dissonance between what is felt and what is lived. Over time, this dissonance creates numbness. Avoidants may pride themselves on being low drama, but underneath that calm often lies emotional suppression. And suppression always demands a price. After you leave, they understand that communication is not about winning or losing. It's about witnessing. It's about allowing another person to see you and daring to see them in return. Silence robbed both of you of that mutual witnessing. And now, in the quiet aftermath, they finally hear what they refused to say. What becomes painfully clear is this: the conversations they avoided were the very ones that could have saved the connection. But by the time this truth settles in, the opportunity to speak has passed. Avoidants often believe that emotional distance is a form of strength. They learn early that staying guarded keeps them safe, that needing less means hurting less. So they master the art of self-containment. They share selectively, they reveal carefully, they keep the deeper parts of themselves protected behind composure and independence. While you were there, this distance may have seemed functional. They appeared stable, unbothered, in control. But emotional distance does not eliminate loneliness. It disguises it. In a relationship, vulnerability is the bridge that turns connection into intimacy. Without it, love remains conditional and surface level. You may have offered openness, your fears, your hopes, your wounds, believing that transparency would invite closeness. Instead, you met restraint, deflection, emotional ceilings you could not break through. To the avoidant, vulnerability felt dangerous, not because you were unsafe, but because exposure threatened the identity they had built around self-reliance. They equated openness with loss of power, not realizing that vulnerability is not collapse, it is courage. While you were present, they didn't feel the full impact of this distance. Your emotional availability filled in the gaps. You brought warmth where they brought walls. You carried the depth they avoided. In many ways, you compensated for the lack of vulnerability in the dynamic. And because of that, they never had to fully face the emptiness their distance created. But when you leave, that compensation disappears. The structure they relied on collapses into quiet isolation. This is where the truth confronts them. Emotional distance does not make you strong. It makes you alone. Without vulnerability, there is no true intimacy, only proximity without connection. They begin to feel a hollowness they cannot explain. The routines remain, but the meaning is gone. The independence they prized now feels like isolation. And the realization settles in slowly, that the closeness they feared was the very thing that could have nourished them. In your absence, vulnerability no longer feels optional. It feels necessary. They recognize that intimacy requires risk, and that by refusing that risk, they limited their own capacity to love and be loved. They see that your willingness to open up was not emotional excess, it was emotional health. You weren't asking them to lose themselves. You were inviting them to join you. There is also a spiritual reckoning in this awareness. Emotional distance fragments the self. It creates a split between the inner world and the outer expression. Over time, this split dulls joy and deepens loneliness. Avoidants may appear composed, but internally, they often feel disconnected from their own emotional life. Vulnerability would have brought integration. Distance maintained fragmentation. After you leave, they begin to understand that love cannot survive behind walls. Protection without permeability becomes a prison. They may look back and realize how often they withheld affection, delayed emotional responses, or stayed intellectually engaged but emotionally absent. And in that reflection, they see that vulnerability was never the threat. The real threat was the refusal to be known. This realization doesn't always lead to immediate change, but it plants a seed. A knowing. That emotional distance, while it once felt safe, ultimately cost them connection. And that intimacy, real intimacy, was not something you were trying to take from them. It was something you were offering to share. While you were present, they may have believed that love was something that demanded too much from them. Your needs felt like expectations. Your desire for closeness felt like obligation. Your consistency felt like pressure. To an avoidant heart, love is often filtered through the fear of losing autonomy. They interpret connection as control, and emotional presence as a threat to their freedom. So instead of experiencing love as nourishment, they experience it as weight. What they couldn't see then is that love, in its healthiest form, does not chase or cage, it stays. Presence is not force. It does not require performance or perfection. It simply requires availability. But avoidants are often unfamiliar with this kind of love. They may have learned early that affection was conditional, that closeness came with demands, or that being needed meant being overwhelmed. So when you showed up consistently, without manipulation or ultimatums, it unsettled them. Your calm presence challenged the belief that love must be earned through struggle. While you were there, they may have pulled away, not because you were asking for too much, but because your presence highlighted how little emotional access they were offering. Instead of recognizing this gap, they internalized the discomfort as pressure. They told themselves they needed space, independence, or relief. But what they were truly resisting was the intimacy that comes from being emotionally available to someone who isn't trying to control you. After you leave, a quiet realization begins to form. They notice the absence of someone who showed up without agenda. No one is asking them to open up, yet no one is there to sit beside them either. The contrast becomes clear. Love wasn't pressuring them, it was grounding them. Your presence didn't demand their freedom, it respected it. And now that presence is gone, they feel unanchored. They begin to understand that love expressed through presence is rare. Anyone can create intensity, anyone can spark excitement, but few can offer steadiness without possession. Few can stay emotionally available without trying to dominate or reshape the other person. Your love was not loud, but it was loyal. And only in your absence do they recognize the security that kind of love provided. This awareness often comes with regret. They replay moments where they misinterpreted care as control, where they withdrew instead of leaning in, where they mistook emotional availability for dependency. They realize that presence is not pressure, it is choice. You chose to be there, and that choice was an offering, not a demand. There is also a deeper lesson beneath this realization. Presence invites responsibility, not to change, but to be real. When someone is truly present with you, excuses fall away, avoidance becomes visible. And for someone accustomed to emotional distance, that visibility can feel confronting. Your presence didn't force them to grow, but it made stagnation harder to hide. And that discomfort was misread as pressure. Spiritually, presence is one of the purest expressions of love. It mirrors divine faithfulness, the kind that does not abandon, rush, or coerce. It simply remains. To someone unfamiliar with that steadiness, it can feel overwhelming. But after you leave, they understand that what they pushed away was not confinement, but grace. They begin to see that love does not require losing yourself. It requires showing up as yourself. And presence, true presence, is not about holding someone back. It's about holding space. And only once that space is gone do they realize how supported they truly were. While you were present, your efforts to be understood may have gone unnoticed. You explained your needs. You expressed your boundaries. You tried to communicate the depth of what you were feeling, But avoidance has a way of dulling the impact of words spoken too close. Familiarity can create blindness. When someone knows you will stay, they don't always listen deeply. Your patience became expected. Your forgiveness became assumed. And the lessons you were trying to teach through love were filtered through comfort and proximity. There is a strange truth about human awareness. Distance sharpens perception. What was once background becomes foreground. What was once constant becomes valuable. When you leave, your absence speaks louder than your explanations ever could. It disrupts patterns. It breaks emotional autopilot. And in that disruption, understanding finally begins to form. Not because you said more, but because you stopped saying anything at all. While you stayed, they could deflect, delay, or minimize. They could promise change without urgency. They could believe there would always be more time. Your presence softened consequences. It gave space for avoidance to continue without immediate cost. But once you left, the emotional environment changed. There was no longer a buffer between their choices and their impact. The silence created by your absence became instructive. It forced reflection where conversation had failed. They begin to understand things you tried to explain, but were never truly heard. Why emotional availability mattered. Why consistency was not optional. Why connection requires effort from both sides. These truths land differently when they are no longer theoretical. When you are gone, the lessons are no longer suggestions. They are realities. And reality has a way of teaching without negotiation. Your absence also removes the possibility of misinterpretation. Words can be twisted. Emotions can be dismissed. But absence is unambiguous. It says, this is the result, not as punishment, but as consequence. And consequences educate the nervous system in ways explanations never can. They feel the gap where your presence once lived. They notice the emotional labor you carried. They recognize the stability you provided. And in that recognition, understanding finally takes root. This is not about blame or revenge. It is about clarity. Your leaving was not an act of abandonment. It was an act of alignment. You chose truth over tolerance, self-respect over self-erasure. And that choice created a mirror they could no longer avoid. In that mirror, they see not just what they lost, but what they failed to nurture. There is also a sacred aspect to this process. Some lessons cannot be learned through persuasion. They require separation. They require the removal of comfort so growth can occur. Divine wisdom often teaches through absence, when presence is taken for granted. Your departure was not random. It was purposeful. It honored a higher order where love is mutual, not one-sided. They may replay moments where you were patient beyond measure, where you stayed longer than you should have, where you tried to love them into awareness. And they may finally understand that your leaving was the final communication, the one that did not require words. You taught them what you were worth by walking away. Whether they grow from that lesson or not is no longer your responsibility. The teaching has been delivered, the truth has been revealed, and what matters most is this. You are no longer waiting to be understood by someone who could only learn once you were gone. Thank you for staying with me through these words, for giving your time, your attention, and your heart. If something here resonated with you, know that it's because your spirit is already awake to truth. You didn't imagine the depth you felt. You didn't ask for too much. And you weren't wrong for wanting connection that was real, mutual, and whole. As you go, carry this with you. Sometimes the bravest act of love is knowing when to let go. Not with anger, not with regret, but with grace. What was meant for you will never require you to abandon yourself. What honors you will meet you in clarity, not confusion. Thank you for choosing growth over familiarity, self-respect over silence, and truth over comfort. May you leave this space lighter than you arrived, trusting that what you released made room for something aligned. Until we meet again, walk gently, stand firmly, and remember your worth. Goodbye, and be at peace.